All right. So in our study of Daniel, though, let me just, if you're new, let me just kind of give a brief summary, really briefly. You might think, well, where does this fit in the whole Old Testament deal? It's during the exile time, which is after the heyday of Israel. They kind of wandered around for a while. They got their land, and then eventually things started to go downhill. The prophets came along and said, either you need to shape up or God's going to ship you out. And they didn't shape up, and God shipped them out, but he wasn't doing it in a mean, vindictive way. He took them into exile, and God met them there. And in the midst of that exile, Daniel enters into the scene. And his ministry is primarily not to the Jews in the exile, but to the Babylonians who had invited them, not so inviting, invited them to come be with them. And that's where God used Daniel, is in the middle of this exile. And so the book of Daniel really is all about this, that God is sovereign over history. He's in charge over history. Even if you don't see it or understand it or get it, he's still in charge of all of history and all of the empires, setting up and removing kings and empires along the way. He, behind the scenes, is working every day. That all these kingdoms will come to an end, that his kingdom will last forever. And he's working that. Now, in the first 6 chapters, it's all about Daniel and his friends in the Babylonian court. We called them the Three Amigos, and we called Daniel El Guapo, but today we're going to skip all that stuff. And how they lived faithfully to the Lord in the midst of a culture that was diametrically opposed to what they were all about. And how they did that successfully. And not only how they did that successfully, but how God used them to touch a Gentile world, a pagan world, and how God used them to do that. Wow, it's an amazing story. Now, I think it's a theme much like what we could use today in our own world. We live in a world that's got a lot of turmoil in it, don't we? I mean, just a lot of things going on, and you kind of wonder if the ceiling's falling in. But it's not, because God is in charge. Doesn't mean everything's going to be easy or everything's going to be like we want it to be, but he is involved. He's behind the scenes. He is still in charge. He is sovereign. Never lose sight of that. Okay? Now, chapter 1 is all about our identity, that who you be will determine what you do. And that what you do proclaims what you believe, and what you believe is always speaks clearly to the world. And we'll see that in the chapters to come. Now, chapter 2 is all about the authority exercised out of fear, like the Babylonians did. It was pathetic. It was terrible. But there is a God whose character we can trust, to whom we can offer praise and honor. And that's what we're going to do today. And then in chapter 3, and I'll just read this, I think this really describes chapters 4, 5, and 6, okay? So in this world, you will be asked to conform to the norms of the culture around us. And if we don't, we will be accused of violating something profound in this new culture. And if we confirm our stance, we will face contempt. That's what happened in these chapters. But if we stand strong, there will be some who will be transformed by the truth and the grace, who will be promoted and glorified by some of the very ones who were at one point antagonistic. And then we're going to find that today again. That's what we really see. Because in chapter 4, we found that Big Nebo's difficult journey was not that different from ours. It was from pride to humility. And that in that humility, he had influence. Not in his pride, not in his abilities, but in his humility. And we find him at the end of that chapter saying, the God of Daniel is awesome. Right? Then in chapter 5, what happens is we have Belshazzar, who had difficulty in honoring the awesome one, in whose hand, the God in whose hand was his breath. He had difficulty, right? And he never would acknowledge it. And we find him at the end of the chapter being killed by the Medes and the Persians who overrun him. So today in chapter 6, we're going to look at the last part of this historical part of Daniel, because in chapters 7 through 12 is the apocalyptic prophetic part of Daniel. At this point, I aim to next summer go through those chapters with us, because they're very complicated, they're very interesting, they're a little wild. We look at that in connection with Revelation, and we'll see what he has to say. But in chapter 6, let's just kind of jump in and see what it has to say and how we might be able to apply it. So in chapter 6, verse 1, it pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps. Now, Darius is a Mede, probably a general, a very strong general. Cyrus is not, who is a Persian, And we usually talk about the Medes and the Persians being together. They had kind of combined themselves to overwhelm the Babylonians. And Darius is probably a general over the armies. Cyrus is really actually the king, but Darius is now kind of in charge before Cyrus comes to take over. And so we call him, Darius is often referred to as a king. But it says, he's pleased to set over the kingdom 120 satraps. These are basically governors. These are just officials. They're government officials that are given in 120 sections of the country, kind of like states, if you will. And they are put over to be throughout the whole kingdom. And verse 2, and over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one, of whom these satraps should give account, so that the king might suffer no loss. Amazing to me. All of a sudden, Darius comes in, and very quickly he understands who Daniel is and how valuable he is. And he quickly makes him one of the 3 that are over these 120. It's an incredible position. Then look at this. And then in verse 3, and then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps. He became distinguished. Now look at this, and I want to circle it. Because an excellent spirit was in him. There was something unique about this man. Now let's remember, he's been serving now there in Babylon for almost 70 years. He came as a teenager. He stood up tall and strong for his faith in his God. But over the years, he had been used in amazing ways. In 70 years, he's been serving there. And he distinguished himself by this unique spirit, this character that was developed over time. You see, character is never developed overnight. Character is only developed by exercising discipline, wisdom, discernment over a period of time, and it creates a man of great character. We often want character to happen instantaneously, don't we? We want it to happen now. I want to be able to do my thing and be a knucklehead if I want to be. And then when it comes time for having character, I'll say, I'll step back into that and I'll have character. Guess what? It doesn't work. Character takes time to develop. Because when pressure comes, it will squeeze out of the seams of your soul who you really actually are. And that is developed over time. You ever notice when something happens and something comes blurting out? I'll tell this story. She's not here. It's not my wife. It's my mom. And I have never heard her cuss once my whole life until a few years ago. And it just came popping out in this situation that was full of tension, full of pressure, and she's like, unloads with one. And we all like, oh my gosh, what just happened? It was amazing. It was in there somewhere, but it just came popping out, this 88-year-old gal, it was just the funniest thing. Kind of odd, a little uncomfortable. I'm like, Mom, I've never heard you say that our whole lives. It was just weird. But when the pressure comes, that which is in us comes out, right? It is. It's like custard in a donut. When you press on it, it just comes out, You can tell what kind of donut I like. But inside of Daniel is this excellent spirit, this incredible character. And they made him and put him, he was distinguished above all the rest. Wow, it's amazing. Look at verse 4. Then the high officials and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom, but they could find no ground for complaint or any fault because he was faithful, and no error or fault was found in him. Now, you guys, in the Bible, there's hardly anybody in the Bible that there's not a negative side to. You can just find it. And that's what I love about the Bible. It's very honest. It's very real. It doesn't try to hide. And so we have David, who's a man after God's own heart, and he was an adulterer, and he was an accomplice to murder. He was a liar. He faked his insanity at one point. The guy was kind of all over the place. It doesn't try to paint him as Mr. Perfect. But I'll have to be honest with you, it's really hard to find anything wrong with Daniel. Now, I'm sure he had problems. I don't know what it was. They don't really tell us. But here is this really incredible man of character. Wow. And then this. Then these And then these men said, we shall not find any ground. Let's circle it. We shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God. They understood that they were not going to find fault in his character. And so they were going to set up a conflict between his faithfulness to God in the situation here of the Medes and the Persians. They understood it. They were going to catch him in his religious convictions and make it an issue. Sound similar to today? It does sound similar today. Now, look in verse 6. Then these high officials and satraps came by agreement to the king and said to him, O King Darius, live forever. You're the stud. You're the guy. We want you to be the guy. So here's the deal. All the high officials of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps and the counselors and the governors all agreed that the king should establish an ordinance to enforce an injunction which whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the lion's den. Now, I don't think this was so much as a religious thing. I think it was more of a political thing. Here are the Medes and the Persians have come and they have taken over. And here's Darius, who is the one who's governing this right now. And they say, you know what? They need to understand there's a new sheriff in town. They need to understand that you are the guy. And so what we need to do just for 30 days is make sure no one else appeals to any other god or anything except for you. Because we need to establish power. We need to establish credibility. And Darius, you're the guy. They're kind of building him up, right? And for his political power here. Now look in verse 8. O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. The one thing I like about this is it seems to be a culture that's committed to law rather than people. That even Darius couldn't change it if it was set to law, signed and agreed to. But he trapped himself, right? They trapped him and he trapped himself into doing exactly what it would say. It says, therefore, King Darius signed the document and the injunction. It was like, all right, it's law. Wow, look at this in verse 10 then. Because Daniel is going to face the contempt of this setup, this conspiracy. Then Daniel knew that when Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went into his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open towards Jerusalem. And he closed the windows so they wouldn't see. No, that's not what it says. It says this. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God. And now let's circle this. As he had done previously. You see, it was his habitual commitment to pray 3 times a day with the window open towards Jerusalem, and it didn't matter who saw. He was committed to that God, and he loved him dearly. And now all of a sudden, it is against the law to do it. And he went up and he said, I don't care. And he left the window open, and he'll pray anyway. Doesn't matter. Wow, I think that's incredible. And what I find here is that his convictions didn't happen just then, did they? They were already in place. He'd been doing this his whole life. This is nothing new. He was not afraid. He was not concerned. This is not some nice religious exercise. He'd been doing this privately for 70 or 80 years before this. He understood who God was. He understood who he was. He understood who these people were. And he was not afraid. Wow, I think it's incredible. Look at verse 11. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and plea before his God. It was a conspiracy. It was a setup. They were looking to get him, and they got him. Now look at this in verse 12. Then they came near and said before the king concerning the injunction, hey, king, didn't you sign an injunction? You can just hear it, can't you? You just want to say, you bunch of weasels. But did you not sign an injunction that anyone who makes petition to any god or man within 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? And the king said, the thing stands fast. That's right. I signed it. That's the way we're doing it. That's the way it's going. According to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. Wow, look at 13. And they answered and said to the king, hey, guess what? Daniel, and what a bunch of tattletales, right? You just want to say, you bunch of little weasels on this thing, you knuckleheads. But Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or the injunction you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times, not just once. It's like they're going, hey, Darius, he doesn't just do it once a day. 3 times a day he's in your face. 3 times a day he's denying who you are. 3 times a day he says, I don't care. I'm going to worship some other God. Wow, it's amazing. Verse 14, then the king, I love this response. Let's get this. Then the king, when he heard these words, as was much distressed and set his mind to deliver Daniel. He knew he'd been trapped. He knew who Daniel was. And he did everything he could to set him free. No, but he couldn't violate the law of the Medes and the Persians. He'd signed it. He'd committed. He knew he'd been had. He hated that, I have a feeling. In fact, we'll see how much he hated it. And he says that he labored till the sun went down to rescue him. He did everything he could. He went to the courts. He went to the Supreme Court. He went to the sheriffs. He did everything he could to set him free without violating the law. You got to just know he's hating it. In fact, here's how much he's hated it. Look in verse 15. And then these men came by agreement to the king, and he said to the king, know, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and the Persians. I mean, they're like coming at him again, right? They're just reinforcing it. That no injunction or ordinance that the king established can be changed. They're holding him to his own authority. That's fabulous. That's amazing. Look in verse 16. Then the king commanded that Daniel be brought and cast into the lion's den. I mean, he was stuck, right? He had to do it. So he did it. It feels a little so like, didn't he have a discussion with him? I want to have say, hey, didn't you take Daniel into a side room and say, hey, bro, I am so sorry. I couldn't help it. No, he didn't do that. He stood up and he said, all right, put him in the lion's den. But he does say this. The king declared to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you. He understood that he had worshiped this God, followed this God, walked with this God. And he says, it's between you and your God now. Wow. Verse 17, and the stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own, not his one, his own signet, and with the signet of his lords, and nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. He exercised the authority he had to exercise. It was his responsibility. They put a wax seal on it and a signet of his own, either ring or something bigger, that said, by the authority of death, if anybody breaks this. Wow. And of the others around him, and nothing might be changed. Then it says the king went to his palace, and he spent the night fasting. It's what he knew he could do now. He appealed to the same God, right? May the God that you've served continually, Daniel, may he be over you. And he says, I'm going to go pray to the same God. I'm going to fast. No diversions were brought to him. He says, no one bother me all night. Don't you dare bring something in here. I've got more important things to do. Don't bug me with taxes. Don't bother me with any other issues of the kingdom. I'm going to fast all night, and I'm going to pray. And it brought him in, and it says that sleep fled from him. All night he was up. You've probably had those nights. You've probably had those times where life has just gripped you by the throat. There have been nights for me where you just are so grabbed by the issues of life that you can't sleep. For many of you parents, there have been times where you have stood outside the door of your kids' doors and you have vehemently prayed for them. I think that's what's going on here. He was so gripped by this that he couldn't sleep. And he prayed, he gave his whole soul to this all night long and fasted. Said, don't bug me. No one come in here. It's a pretty powerful moment, I think. Verse 19. Then, the break of day, the king rose and went in haste to the lion's den. I like the fact that he went. He didn't just stay in his palace and tell someone, hey, go check. If he's dead, he's dead. He just stayed in his palace. He took personal responsibility. He was personally invested. He went. And he goes there, and it says, as he came near to the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish. I mean, we can almost miss the power of the emotion here, don't we? Of the humanity that's going on here. And he enters in a tone of anguish. The king declared to Daniel, "O Daniel, servant of the living God." That doesn't happen very often, this term, the living God. It says, "In the servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually." You keep getting that, right? "I have watched your faithfulness. Has he been able to deliver you from the lions?" And Daniel said to the king, "Hey, king, live forever, bro." And I'm sure, I'm sure that we find Darius here, and he has got to be flipped out. He goes, "Are you kidding? Oh my gosh." Well, he doesn't say that exactly. He goes, in verse 22, we continue on with what Daniel said. "My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths." Now, sent his angel. It's singular here. Doesn't name which angel. We only have a few that are named in the Bible, Michael and Gabriel. I don't know if it was one of them. Somehow there was an angel came. So, you've seen this kind of depicted in paintings. So I don't know what happened. Some of those pictures or those paintings have Daniel hanging out with the lions, petting them like they're dogs, laying down, sleeping on them in the night. It might have happened that way. Of course God could do that, right? Or it might have been that they were on one side and he's on another, and they're like growling their heads off, and there's an angel in between saying, "You stay on your side, you stay on yours. We're going to be okay here till morning comes." I don't know how it happened. Any of that could have happened, right? But whatever happened is this angel was standing there being a mediator, if you will, on God's behalf. And so no harm comes to Daniel. Then the king was exceedingly glad. So this word exceedingly glad in the Aramaic, which is this part, this has this idea. He was jumping up and down out of excitement. And so when he comes and he goes, "Hey, yo, Darius, live forever." He's like, "Oh my gosh, yes, I can't believe it." I mean, that's the way it feels, He was so exceedingly glad. He's just going bonkers. You guys, I don't like to be weird up here, but, sometimes we make the scriptures so boring. We make it so boring, but it's not boring. In this thing, he's like fired up. He's jumping up and down around. The only person in this room embarrassed is my daughter. And so, but he's like, yes, yeah, is what he's doing here. So, and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him, not even a scratch, because he had trusted in his God. Wow. Okay, I'm tired. Okay. That's incredible. That's how excited they were over this. Verse 24, then the king commanded, and those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and cast into the den of lions. Not uncommon at all in that day and age that if you accuse someone wrongly, that you are to experience the punishment of the crime. So that's what happens here. And so they cast them into the den of lions, their children, and their wives. And before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke their bones to pieces. Wow. That's incredible what happens. Verse 25. Let's look at the transformation here. Then King Darius wrote to all the peoples, nations, in languages that dwell in all the earth, in the whole thing. Now, you guys, the Persian Empire was probably, arguably, the largest empire the world's ever known. Bigger than the Babylonian Empire, bigger than the Roman Empire, bigger than the Greek Empire. It was bigger than all of those. And so when he says to all the earth, it probably wasn't literally every square. North America probably wasn't included yet. But it was the biggest empire that he had control over that the world's ever seen. And he says for this, peace be multiplied to you. Now he makes another decree. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion, people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. Wow. And now it's going to describe the God of Daniel. For he, let's circle it, for he, the God of Daniel, look at these truths about him. He is a living God that endures forever. He is a real God that endures forever. He is living and active in the world today. And he will endure forever. That's the kind of God we're talking about. We're not talking about a God of wood. We're not talking about a God of stone. We're talking about not ones that are dumb and do not hear, but we have a God who hears and sees, and he is involved, and he endures forever. Look at this, the next one. That his kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. That's the God we serve. And because I feel good about life or bad about life doesn't change the fact that that's who God is. That his kingdom will never be destroyed, and it has dominion to the very end. Wow, that's incredible. Look at this. He delivers and rescues. He delivered and rescued Daniel, didn't he? You ever been in the lion's den? Guess what? You live in one every day. Every day. He did too. For 70 years, he'd served in Babylon. It was a lion's den. We live in a lion's den. It's just the way it is. But he delivers and rescues. And look at this last one. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. That he is at work. He is working. And he'll do whatever it takes as long as we cooperate. Wow, that's incredible. And so at the very end, verse 28. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. He did well. It's not the point of this chapter. It doesn't always turn out like that. But he did benefit. He prospered. He didn't want it. That's not why he was doing it. But he did prosper. Wow, that's pretty incredible. So, therefore, what now? What do we take away from this? How do we apply this? There's all sorts of stuff here. Great stuff on leadership in this chapter. There's all sorts of fun stuff. But I've just got 4 things I want to highlight. First of all is this. Daniel stood out because of his excellent character. And that character had to be developed over time. He stood out because of his amazing character. If the influence of the Christian church in America is diminished, it is not because of our theology. It is because of our lack of character. Our lack of living out what we say we believe. I wonder if we could be more like Daniel, let God do incredible things in our soul. It's hard. Character's developed. It's not developed easily, let me put it that way. It is developed with a hammer as God chisels away on who we are. And it just keeps chiseling away. If we let God do his work, we could be people of character rather than people of great theology. I want us to be both, right? But great theology without character falls really short. It doesn't carry the day. So Daniel stood out because of his excellent character. Secondly, Daniel's only fault was his commitment to God. That was his fault that we see here. His greatest fault is his commitment. And I have a feeling he did it with without arrogance, with great humility. But he also was very tenacious. He stood strong to walk with God. He didn't close the windows when he prayed. And they caught him. And they knew they'd catch him, right? So it doesn't mean that you need to pray in the lunchroom at work, but it doesn't mean to have that kind of commitment to him. Whatever that might look like. God will show you what that looks like. Third, Daniel's faithfulness was not built in the moment. It was built over a long period of time. When you're faithful in one thing and you're faithful in another, it builds a pattern of being faithful in much. And the Lord tells us that he who is faithful in little will be faithful in much. And we find Daniel being faithful for 70 years of service in Babylon. Do you know people like that? I do. And they're stunning. People who have faithfully walked with God. And they don't raise a flag and draw attention to themselves. They just are incredibly solid in what they do. It is a beauty in this culture. Those are the people we need to look for. And so the people who have done that, on the most part, either have gray hair or no hair. And so we live in a culture that dismisses them, right? We tell them, please go away. This is all about young people. This is all about us. Or them. Or I don't know if I'm young or not. But, I have gray hair. I guess I'm not. And I'm losing my hair. So I guess that puts me in the next group. But You guys, we need to really tap into the wisdom of those who have walked with God for a long time. Understand. Let him love us. Let him give us insight. One day I said to a guy in this room, I said, Callie, I thought I taught my child better. He said, you may have. They just didn't learn better. I thought, wow, that's pretty wise. I never thought of that. Now, I could have taught them better. But they could have learned better too, right? Daniel's faithfulness is not built in a moment. And the last one, you guys, I want to take us into communion with this, is that the God of Daniel, and he's our God too, right? The God of Daniel, the awesome one, is worthy of all of our thanks, praise, and of our full devotion. Wow. You see, when Darius made this decree, he understood that Daniel's God was awesome. He was amazing. And he asked the whole world to worship him. Now, not everyone did. But that's where he came to. We find the same thing with Nebuchadnezzar. Belshazzar, he skipped it, right? He denied God that. And here we find Darius, who would worship the same God. And he asked the whole world to do it. I think that's pretty incredible. And so we come to this place where we need to acknowledge that he is worthy of all of our thanks and all of our praise and all of our devotion, our full devotion of our whole lives, because he is an awesome God. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm in the process of trying to figure that out in my life. I don't have it all together. If you do, come up here, because I just don't have it all together. I'm trying to figure out, how do I fully devote my life to him in every way, shape, or form, rather than trying to live by faith or live in my religiosity or live in this position of being a pastor. You know, it doesn't really matter, right? We're all the same when we go out of here. We go home and we have floors to clean, toilets to scrub, lawns to mow. It's all the same life we have. And then I'm just this human being standing before an awesome God. And how do I devote myself to him fully? To say goodbye to the things of the world and say hello to the things of him. And to be a man like Daniel, who would stand strong in the midst of a culture headed the opposite direction, that we would come and worship him. I think that's what the call of Daniel has been for our lives. To stand strong, to stand tough, not to stand arrogantly, but to stand with humility, but to not give up on an awesome God. So where are you at today? How do you respond to that? What do you do with that? Well, this week, I encourage you to wrestle with it. What would it mean to be fully devoted to him? Now, you guys, maybe the place to start is by coming this morning, if you're a believer in Christ, if you're a follower of him, to say, okay, I'm going to come and I'm going to celebrate. Jesus said, whenever you do this to his disciples, do this in remembrance of me, and to remember the fact that he gave his body broken for us. That all of that brokenness in us, he took it on himself. So I love the fact that when you say, well, I've got all this sin in my life, and he says, yes, pile it right here on my shoulders, because I'm taking this to the cross, because I'll take it for you. We're not just going to take your sin and remove it from you. We're going to take your sin and remove it from you, and we're going to put it on Jesus Christ, and I'll take it to the cross for you. It's amazing. We're not just excused, we're forgiven as he puts it on himself. He takes his blood and he sheds it for you and for me, to take all the crud in my life, that his shed blood makes me clean. Wow, it's incredible. So this morning, as you say, you know what, I want to be fully devoted to him. We can never do it out of the power of the flesh. We can only do it out of the power of the Spirit, right? And the only way that the Spirit could ever be in our lives is to take that sacrifice of Christ and to tell him, thank you. Thank you. Fill me with your Spirit. Fill me with your life. Live your life in me and through me. Right? And so this morning as you come, let's just take a moment to prepare your hearts, and then you can come. And if you're serving communion this morning, why don't you come on up? And so as you come this morning, it's just to say, okay, God, you're calling me to something. You're calling me to you. You're calling me to walk with you, to love you. to say no to a culture that's headed the wrong way and say yes to you. Even if I live in the minority, that's where I'm going. That's what I choose. And I start with celebrating the sacrifice of Christ in our lives. Let's pray. Father, the example of Daniel is magnificent. It's stunning as he served you in the Babylonian courts, in the courts of the Medes and the Persians. Not a lot of encouragement, not a lot of support, but he served you because he knew who you were, and he knew who he was in you. And so for every time he was threatened, he simply trusted you. And Father, we're threatened, we're pushed on, we're challenged, we are stretched, we are discouraged, we are sometimes absolutely confused. But Father, none of that has changed who you are. None of it has diminished your awesomeness. So Father, help us to turn and to trust you, the God of the lion's den. May we just trust you wherever we might find ourselves. And Father, most of all, we thank you for your Son, who you sent in an incredibly miraculous way of a virgin birth, of an amazing life, of a death on the cross and the resurrection from the dead. And we do look forward to the day he comes back. But until then, we want to live lives that are fully devoted to you. And so we come here and give you thanks for your Son and what he did. So when you're ready, as you desire, come and celebrate what Christ has done for you.